My name is Claire Wardle, and I'm the US Director of First Draft. And for those of you who don't know us, we basically are a non-profit helping journalists navigate the world of disinformation and media manipulation. So we're big fans of this book. I wrote a couple of chapters. And so when it was published last week, I said to Craig, would you mind if we had a bit of a chat about it? Because it really is, it touches on so many topics that we think about all the time. And so I want to show you the book, well, a picture of the book. So this is it. Although Craig will talk about this, it's not quite in that lovely form right now, as it looks like a coffee table book. But it was arranged and organized by the European Journalism Centre, our friends in Europe, who published the first verification handbook that came out in 2014, which I was also helped write a chapter for. And it was very generously funded by Craig Newmark, who I think from the chat is actually on, is part of this conversation. So maybe Craig might have a question a little bit later on. Hi, Craig. But we thought it would be useful for Craig to talk a little bit about the book, what inspired him to do it, and to pull apart some of the chapters, because we want this to be a tease, so that maybe you've seen tweets about it, but you haven't yet got round to downloading the book. We want this to be a moment when you're like, oh, this is the weekend I'm going to read it. So over to you, Craig.
Oh, thank you, Claire. And it is great to have such a wonderful group of panelists here. You can see, and we'll hear from everybody here on the panel soon. Everybody on this panel has contributed to the handbook, wrote at least one chapter or a case study, and I'm really thrilled about that. Now, let's take a look at what's inside the book to give everybody a sense of what we're talking about here. And as Claire said, you know, this is not the first edition of the handbook. First one came out in 2014, which feels like a completely different world in terms of the topics that we're dealing with. It really dealt with kind of foundational issues around, hey, there's so much potentially newsworthy content being shared on social media. How do you verify images and video? How do you think about, you know, reaching out to people and verifying, you know, tweets and other kinds of content that are out there? And so that handbook came out at a time when this was still a pretty emerging discipline within journalism, but also starting to spread and really become something that NGOs and human rights organizations and first responders and other people out there were starting to figure out how to do. And so things have changed a lot since 2014, and it was probably about a year ago that I started thinking that we were probably entering a time where it was necessary for us to have a new edition, and it would make sense to really focus it in on a particular topic. After we did the first edition in 2014, we put out one focused on investigative journalism after that. But this one is the first one where, you know, we focused even more in on disinformation and media manipulation. And so the book is in 3 main sections. And basically what I got to do was think about my dream team of journalists and researchers and people working in this area who do the work of identifying these kinds of campaigns, of, you know, finding the truth behind the kinds of things you see on social media, and get them to come in and write different things. So our first section is one that 2 of the people who are on this webinar with us contributed to. So one, I wrote a piece of sort of what I consider to be like, what kind of mindset do you need to have when you're investigating the digital environment? And that's a really important thing, because the tools and the techniques don't mean anything if you can't really think about how to approach this work and understand how easy it is to manipulate this environment. And then Claire and Joan, who are both here with us, wrote the other 2 chapters here in the introduction. So this is about trying to give people some theory and some context and a mindset about how you do this work. And I think it's really important, even if you're somebody who's really interested in the tools and techniques of like, well, how do I do this? You can't do the work well unless you understand the broader context of how this ecosystem is behaving, of how the bad actors create this life cycle of media manipulation, and how journalists are approaching this work. So that's kind of our first section there. And then in our next section, we get into a focus on actors and content. So social media accounts, you know, the people and the content that they produce as part of disinformation or media manipulation campaigns. And the first chapter there is from one of our participants, Brandy, talking about how to use a variety of tools, but also really clever ways of approaching how you look at a social media account and how you find how it's connected to others, how you find out who might be really behind it. And we've got a case study there from Donie from CNN, who's with us as well, where he helped find out that, you know, the biggest Black Lives Matter page, which seemed to be run from the US, was actually run by a guy in Australia and had nothing to do with the movement. So Donie will talk about that a bit. And we tried to make this handbook a little more global than the previous ones were in terms of contributors. So we have people, from the Philippines and from Brazil and other places around the world. And we have case studies about the Philippines, about, Iran, about things going on in Hong Kong, to try and not make it a very, Western or US focused kind of book. And so some of the other chapters there, we have people from Bellingcat. We have an academic, Farida Vis, from the UK, talking about not just, doing reverse image search, but actually how do you think about an image? And it might be a real image, but is it moved into a different context, and how do you question that? And then, the last chapter in this section is looking at deepfakes and synthetic and emerging media manipulation technologies, which are still sort of early, but, they're starting to make their way out in the wild. And this is less about, here's the tools and techniques, and more about how do we think about investigating this stuff, because it's moving so quickly. And then we have our kind of last section of the book where we move from actors and content to talking about platforms. So talking about messaging apps. Claire wrote a chapter on investigating messaging apps. And then we look at websites, a chapter I wrote about investigating them. And of course, we talk about social networks. And the last part here in the handbook that is a really important one is looking at network analysis and attribution. And attribution is one of the really, really tricky areas in this, which is basically pointing the finger saying, well, those networks of Twitter accounts or what have you, they actually were being run by X. And a lot of times journalists and researchers, we might be a little too quick to point the finger at someone, and it can open up a lot of problems, not just from naming the wrong party, but it undermines trust in the work that we do. And so we have some great, case studies and examples about how you start to determine who is behind something and what kind of level of confidence you need, and how to go about that work. And I'll also give a plug for a project from First Draft that they're involved in, Attribution.news, which really looks even more in depth at how you do attribution for these kinds of campaigns. And so that's kind of the quick overview of the handbook. It is free. It is online at the URL that you see above. And as Claire noted, right now it's just in the web version. We don't actually have a hardcover book you can see. So if people want to make jokes about fake news and the hardcover book right now, just get that out of your system, because we don't want to hear that term anymore, okay? But we are working on getting a PDF version that you can download if you prefer that format. But for right now, you can read it online, read it for free. Lots, as I say, of a mix of the theory and the context and the approach that you need to have, and then just amazing hands-on guidance and case studies from people who are doing this work every day. And I think it's a great addition to kind of, more and more guides and research and information that's out there about doing this work. And I hope that not just journalists, but lots of people in the field make use of it. And the last thing I'll just say is that we also try to make it very accessible, in that you do not need to know computer programming. You do not need to be an advanced user to necessarily come in and read this and understand and do these things. I think it is very accessible. And while some of the stuff may not be immediately applicable, perhaps in your daily work, the reality is that on any beat, whether you are actually focused on disinformation or not, knowing these techniques, these approaches, knowing how the environment is manipulated has now become absolutely essential for every journalist on every beat. So even if you don't specialize in this, I think it's still really important information for every journalist and lots of other researchers to have. So that's my spiel. Back to you, Claire.
Thanks, Craig. So I was so excited about this that I forgot to introduce everybody. And I should not assume that everybody knows everybody, even though I sort of feel like everybody is a close friend. But Joan just came on and said, oh, Donie, I've never met you. And I've never met Brandy in real life. So just so that everybody knows everybody, Brandy Zadrozny is from NBC and basically does incredible work tracking disinformation, particularly around health misinformation. And I think Brandy was doing great work that showed the harm that was coming from health misinformation way before the coronavirus. We have Donie O'Sullivan from CNN, who unfortunately has to leave us in about 20 minutes because he's going to be live on CNN talking about the pandemic. So we're going to go to Donie first in a second. But last but not least, Joan Donovan, a good friend, who is the research director at the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. And Joan is a warrior around understanding and tracking disinformation and does incredible work. And you see her quoted all over. In fact, in the piece that Brandy wrote yesterday, has a great quote about the pandemic itself. And Craig Silverman, of course, is media editor of BuzzFeed and the grandfather of the study of disinformation, as we like to call him, maybe the godfather.
So yeah, can we go godfather? Grandfather sounds really old. I mean, Gosh.
Your hair's not as grey as it could have gone in the...
It's back here it is. Let's take a look at that. There we go.
I see that. Great. So what I thought was that we'd go around everybody on the call to talk, so they could talk about their chapter. And I've asked them actually to apply their chapter to some of the things that we've seen this week around the pandemic. So for those of you who don't know, this is a documentary, and in the last couple of days, kind of the part one got dropped, has a number of claims in it about coronavirus, really problematic claims. And what I would argue is most problematic is there's a connection to Dr. Fauci. It's being used to undermine Dr. Fauci as a messenger. And we've actually seen these kind of techniques being used over the last 3 or 4 weeks. This documentary, which you could argue may have just stayed on the fringes, all of a sudden was trending yesterday on Twitter. And as a result, we have mainstream media talking about it. So in that way, I thought it would be useful to get people to think about their particular chapter and how it applied to the pandemic. But this is kind of an amazing moment to have everybody on this call to talk about the pandemic, because it epitomizes all of the things that we see in the book. So maybe Donie, you could kick us off so people can ask you questions before you have to leave.
Sure. Well, the chapter I have in the book is about what was the biggest Black Lives Matter page on Facebook. It had about 700,000 followers. And throughout 2017, as we started to learn that Russia and Russian trolls had set up all these massive US activist groups, we found that they had particularly targeted African Americans and the Black Lives Matter movement. And with that, we had seen a lot of big pages, 300,000 and 400,000 follower pages come down. But as we were reporting on that and speaking to activists, a lot of folks were saying, we still don't know who's behind the biggest page. And of course, that's not necessarily unusual. A lot of activists do want to remain anonymous, or anonymous as they can be when they're running pages like this. But it was actually an independent researcher, Jeremy Masler, who tipped us off. He had pulled all the data, all the posts from the Facebook page, and noticed that over time they were consistently linking to a sort of same set of URLs. Those websites had been registered anonymously at the time in 2017. But if you went back through the historical records using tools like domaintools.com, you could see that on one day, just for a few days, for a few moments, one of the websites, a Black Lives Matter site, was registered to a white guy in Australia named Ian McKay. And as we looked into it, we found that, Ian had registered a lot more websites. So, when I eventually called him up and tracked him down, he told me, he bought and sold domains, which is something sort of quite believable. But what gave it away for us really was shortly after I hung up the phone with Ian, the page came down temporarily. Not taken down by Facebook, but it came down. And then after a week or two, it came back up. And I think he thought we had forgotten about him. And that's what really made us start looking into things. I know I need to keep this brief. So long story short, how we were actually able then to figure out that he was behind it based off first some of that open source reporting, second, talking to the guy. But then once we started looking into the fundraising platforms, the ad platforms he was using, speaking to sources in the companies, was really how we were able to pull this story together. And I think he had stolen essentially from the Black Lives Matter movement at least $100,000. He had run fake fundraisers. The incredible thing was when we brought all this evidence to Facebook, they told us it's not a violation of their rules, which we almost published, but and last moment I felt sort of bad for them, and I called up a more senior Facebook person and I said, you realize that this is crazy what you're saying? And they eventually looked more into it. So I think lessons though from that that you could take for the current pandemic is, open source reporting is critical and so important, but it is vital for many stories now to combine that with your traditional reporting, whether it's having sources or whether it's collaborating with others in your newsroom right now, the health reporters, national security reporters, White House reporters, and so you guys can combine skills.
Great. Thanks, Donie. And so if anybody has questions for Donie, please put them into the chat, because we've only got him for another 15 minutes. The clock is ticking. So maybe I could ask Joan to go next, because Joan wrote a chapter in the kind of opening section. which I think gives a really important theoretical framework for understanding media manipulation. So maybe, Joan, you could talk a little bit about your chapter and how you can apply that to what we're seeing this week.
Hey, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Claire, for pulling this together, and Craig for wrangling the cats, and Craig Newmark for funding the whole thing. I mean, it's been quite an experience, and actually really rewarding for the fact that someone else did a really good job with the editing work. So I didn't have to fight with myself a lot, which sometimes can be hard as a researcher wanting to communicate things to a general audience. But so I linked in the chat here the actual chapter that I wrote, just so you can look at some of the diagrams involved. But one of the things that we look at is what we call the life cycle of media manipulation. And it's actually a research framework and tool that allows us to remember where along this life cycle are we plugged in, and where do we have evidence, and where are we missing evidence. And that way, if you find something, so say, like, for instance, with the pandemic, you've got everyone and their mom is retweeting and reposting and putting this up online, being like, this famous scientist has said that Fauci is going to shoot vaccines out of drones into your eyeballs, and it's crazy, but it just might be true, right? And you're like, okay, actually, we're in the midst of a media manipulation campaign, but we're not at the beginning of it, actually. So we look at first manipulation campaign planning, who's behind it, where are they talking about it? You know, some of this is just the message boards where people are speculating, or chat rooms where they're saying, don't you think it's possible that, you know, Black people are immune from coronavirus, right? Maybe that's how it starts. But then we look specifically at where the campaign is planted across the web and social platforms. Who's picking up the narrative? Are they newsworthy? And if they are newsworthy, like the president, for instance, or one of many social media influencers, or people who are niche in a certain area that are popular, like YouTubers, are they talking about it? And then the crucial point is looking for responses by either platform companies or industry, responses by activists, politicians, and journalists. And this is something that First Draft really concentrates on a lot, is understanding when journalists should and shouldn't react to disinformation. So, you know, and you can imagine that there's thousands and thousands of media manipulation, disinformation attempts every day, and only a few really crack through this response barrier. And then we look at the changes to the information ecosystem. The pandemic is an interesting one because immediately you have the content pulled down from different platforms after a few hours. And they're like, you know, platform companies are like, you see how fast we did this? This is amazing. Look, we work so fast. And then you see instantly hundreds of copies, literally just copies of it going up all over the web. And then people are sharing it because they're like, this is what they don't want you to know. And whichever, you know, faction you're aligned with, they is a different entity. It could be big pharma. For the anti-Semitic folks, it's always some kind of global conspiracy. For the white supremacists that we track, it's always, you know, governments and you know, the demonic left or the intolerant left that is planning this big thing. But we look specifically at how do changes in the information ecosystem allow for manipulators to adapt to this new environment, and what are the new tactics that they pick up along the way. And then generally the wagon wheel keeps on turning. I mean, it's people describe it as a game of whack-a-mole, but I don't think that that's true. I think it's actually part of the process of just technology in general. We can't think of technology, especially interactive ones, as finished products. They're not. They're continuous processes. They get remade every day in their use cases. And so it's very important for us to understand that this is a condition that we live in. And a lot of times it's a normal condition. You know, me and Claire often talk about normal misinformation, We're like, well, is this just sort of normal for what we see, or is something new happening here? I'll just close by saying, in the case study that I use as an example in the verification handbook, is I look at communities of people that thought they knew the name of the whistleblower during the Trump case, and which social media influencers were really trying to force media to pay attention, and all of the different ways in which media organizations did stand on their ethics and say, this is a whistleblower. If we publish this person's name, even speculatively, we are putting them into immense personal danger. And so when we think about journalist ethics and where it gets applied and where it doesn't get applied, we can also understand, again, during the life cycle, what is preventing some news organizations from doing one thing, but is also emboldening other news organizations into participating in what was this this idea that there was a CIA operative that was the whistleblower, and then layered within it was a disinformation campaign sharing images of the son of George Soros and claiming that he was the whistleblower, but not because he was Soros, but because they were really trying to get people to see that these two white men looked a lot alike because they both had beard and glasses. And so the only pictures of this of Alex Soros are ones where he is in glasses with a beard with prominent Democrats. And then people were trying to sort of fool the audience into thinking that the whistleblower was deep Democratic operative. And this traded all the way up the chain, got all the way up to different major news organizations. But incredibly, Steve King, representative from Iowa, did retweet this as if it was real. And we have the screenshots and the receipts to prove it in that article. So thank you. Appreciate being on the call.
Thanks, Joan. Donie, I do have a question for you, which I actually love, which is, how did you get into mis and disinformation reporting? What's your method for finding and spotting stories? And what is your advice for those who want to pursue this beat?
Ooh, that's a lot. Well, I was working at Storyful in Dublin, as you might pick up from my accents, and we were vetting breaking news content. So, video of bombs and terrorist attacks and all that sort of stuff. So in real time, looking at what is real and what is fake on social media. And CNN eventually hired me to do that. So I was working with both CNN domestic and international, getting those videos on air, making sure what we put on air from social media was real. And then, of course, after the 2016 election, unfortunately not before, once everybody's focus started turning on to mis and disinformation. I know folks on this call, like Craig, were well ahead of the curve, but CNN sort of looked around, I think, and said, hey, young person, or hey, you're our social media person. You can figure out what is going on, in real time, in breaking news, what's fake, but can you figure out what the sort of bigger campaigns were? So that's how I got into it. And it took, it's sort of taken on a life of its own. In terms of how I get stories, my favorite way of getting stories is just getting in the weeds myself and being able to look through accounts and Facebook groups and things like that. But more and more, the more we report, we're relying on a great research community of independent researchers, academics, folks like you guys in First Draft who are sharing tips with us. So a lot of it now is sort of vetting the tips we do get. And of course, there's sort of a downside to that too, is because, there are a lot of activists on all sides of the political spectrum involved in this. And sometimes any account that they see, they want to say, oh, well, that's a Russian troll or that's a Russian bot. And even sort of similarly to this pandemic video that's been going around the past few days, I think the question that a lot of editors and folks immediately asked was, well, who's pushing this? Who's behind it? Is Russia behind it? Is China behind it? And sometimes we have to take a step back and say, it's, nobody has to necessarily be behind it all the time. I can't say conclusively one way or the other with the pandemic video, but I think we need to remind ourselves that, when it comes to domestic actors, whether it's in the US or in Ireland or in the UK or anywhere around the world, people are perfectly capable of creating and sharing and making misinformation go viral themselves without having, a sort of big evil troll factory.
Just very quickly, to Joan's point, were there any conversations internally at CNN yesterday about not covering the pandemic video?
Yes, a lot. And I think that's a challenge when it comes to the size of the outlet too, right? Is that, I think it really does make sense if you are running a local news organization in a city or neighborhood. If you see a piece of misinformation being shared among your community, I think it actually makes sense to go out there and proactively say, no, this is going around the place, this is getting fake, or this is fake. But, if you're the likes of CNN, we always have to say, well, if we cover this, are we actually just amplifying it further and giving it a credence that it might not otherwise have? And, I don't think any person has the answer to that, right? And it really is something that our standards team is really trying to grapple with. My sense on this video was, I was like, look, whatever I think arbitrary a threshold we have to report or fact check or debunk a video, I think pandemic reach that, because I was getting I think a good test is always if you're getting messages from friends, normal people who are not like us, who are not in the weeds of disinformation or follow the news 24/7, and I was getting those multiple messages from friends too. But I mean, I don't know the right answer, and I think that's really something we're going to be grappling with all throughout 2020 and into the future, and particularly obviously coming up to the election as well as we move through the pandemic too.
Well, thanks, Donie. I know you have to go off and talk about the pandemic on CNN, but thank you very much for joining us just before you went live. You've got your hair and makeup looks great. You're fine. You can go. Thank you very much, Donie.
I'll see you guys soon.
Bye. And Brandy, talking about another major national outlet, we would love to hear a little bit from you about your chapter, but also you've already done some great reporting on the pandemic, and would love to hear your insights.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just start on our coverage of the coronavirus so far, which has been just insane. I think it's really important to know, as Donie just said, we are not wanting for domestic disinformation agents, actors, campaigns. Like, they are everywhere. That is enough for me at the moment. I don't need to look towards Russia or China or anyone else at this moment. But with that in mind, I've really been looking at specific people who are looking to financially profit off the pandemic. So I've looked at people that are, registering websites, which are like insane right now. Domain registrations have gone crazy. So who are the people sort of registering these websites? What are they trying to sell you, or how are they trying to scam you? And then, that's led to, it's so much, honestly, from the pandemic to, which we saw days ago, right? Like, we saw basically right when it went up that this was up, because we've been watching this person sort of bubble in the side. RFK was a big one. It had on True Pundit. Like, so the bad spaces I watch a lot, just because I have a tweet deck that's just called Weirdos, and I know all the bad guys and all the people who are going to be spreading this stuff, and we just sort of watch it. And for a day, my colleague Ben and I were, in the First Draft channel, we're just hoping that we weren't going to have to cover this, because she's just a known conspiracy theorist that just has a wild history, and we didn't sort of want her to get any bigger than she was. But when she hit that, your term, the tipping point, we knew that we had to. So how to do it responsibly is sort of how we like to do all of our investigations, whether it's coronavirus, entrepreneur, or, financial, people who are motivated financially, or if it's, literally any other story, which I think hits Craig's point. You want to find out who are the people behind this campaign. Who is the person telling me this? For example, the Bakersfield doctors that you know, have an emergency care center, and they, you know, put on their scrubs and, you know, sat at a press conference and got a local news organization to Facebook Live a press conference of them throwing out wild conspiracies that, you know, hospitals were being pressured to inflate their COVID numbers. At the end of it, talking about people like carrying guns and getting ready for a revolt. Like, this was wild stuff around the coronavirus. So, you know, what I did in that example was I wanted to look at the doctors behind this. And, you know, I'm a trained librarian, so I got my start looking in like court documents and like actual books, you know, those things that it's like the verification, what it's not. That's what I started looking at. So I know how to do those things. And so, but then soon it became apparent that there is no more internet and real life, right? If anything, people have had this illusion of privacy on the internet for so long that they often would share, you know, their real motivations, their real thoughts and feelings, their real associations in that way, and just think that no one would ever figure it out. So I think a lot of people know that that distinction is no longer applicable anymore. Like, there is no IRL and online. It's just everything's all together. It's just life. That's what you should start on. So the idea that anybody would put these doctors in front of a press conference and not look at their Facebook profile and not see that one of the doctors had was behind a new group on Facebook called Californians for Trump or something, and had a video of him, you know, from a truck bed waving an American flag, talking about how like it's finally time that we can no longer be silent. That's important, right? from your coronavirus information dealer, like, you want to know that whatever monetary motivation he might have and whatever, you know, political motivation he might have. So that was sort of jumbled. I hope any of that makes sense, but my brain is very jumbled these days. And, you know, specifically my chapter, I just sort of break down a process that I have. And it's literally when I investigate any story. So it was, you know, the guy behind this notorious, terrible subreddit called The Red Pill, who turned out to be a New Hampshire state legislator, or, you know, anybody who I want to quote, that I want to see, like, what is this person actually like? What does this person actually think online? So I'm going to look up that person. And I use this from backgrounding to breaking news to longer investigations. If there's a shooting, I use these sort of tools and tips. And the things that I go through are, you know, first of all, it's how to put together a puzzle of a whole person. So that's looking at usernames, it's looking at photos, and then it's trying to find little pieces of that puzzle. Maybe it's family members, maybe it's location stuff. You know, I show how you can like look at someone's early Twitter followers and make a really good case for, you know, who they know in real life and who and where they live, because often sort of local things will pop up. So just it's a sort of a long chapter, but it just goes through my thought process and how to connect usernames, photos, biographical details, and create a picture of a person. And that's what we should be trying to do all the time, whether you're a disinformation reporter or not, is find out who's behind the person and get the biggest picture of a person that you can that's trying to tell you something.
Thank you so much, Brandy. And I have to say, I helped Craig a little bit. I read some of the chapters and added comments, and I read Brandy's and I was like, wow, I thought I knew a lot of tools in this space, but like Brandy's is just chock full of things. It really is an incredibly strong, practical chapter for anybody who's like starting to get into this space. So no, it's really, really helpful. And don't apologize for having a jumbled brain. I think all of our brains are.
It's a mess, but
if
I think
you only knew what I think about when I'm allowed to think on my own. I'm like, whoa. Yeah, there's the pandemic has definitely added an entirely new set of actors to this space and timelines, and, you know, and then susceptible audiences. And so people like Brandy have been doing this a long time, and like it's good to be confused right now, because you know that there's new stuff happening and there's puzzles to solve.
And I have to just say, I think seeing different communities coming together, like people want to put people into different boxes. And I think what it's hard to explain is how people are jumping onto narratives if it supports their worldview or cause. And so I think that's something that's really hard, and why you kind of have to do this stuff for a while to understand these communities, and you can't parachute in and do a story without understanding that.
Yeah, I think I have a piece coming out, I think next week now, that sort of profiles Claire and Joan, and I'm really excited about it. But we talked about how, this for me has really been a boss level sort of situation where it does feel like there's just this monster that's this many-headed. I mean, I've written about Second Amendment groups and militant groups and the Boogaloo and, just regular old trolls that, live on the tans and the anti-vaxxers, and then far-right political extremists, and then more traditional, but still far-right media arms like the Epoch Times. And they're all here. It's like they've all come to play. And it's terrifying sometimes to wake up and be like, what do I do today? What do I tackle? And that's why First Draft has honestly been so helpful to me, being in those consortiums and being able to say, okay, what does everybody else think is important? What can we do? And what can we do sort of collaboratively to make sure that we're putting out information that helps the situation if we can, and doesn't do further damage? So just a little plug. You guys are great.
Thank you, Brandy. There's actually a great question from David Clinch, who many of us know. And I'm going to ask this of Craig and Joan. I think there is no comparison between the Plandemic video and the Project Lincoln videos in real terms in the way they are misleading, but you wouldn't know that looking at the way they're being portrayed on either side. They have both been fact-checked and deemed misleading or false in some way. How do we handle this kind of dynamic? And I think, this is not an easy question, but any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple of things on it. I mean, I think
could you just actually just explain the Project Lincoln videos, Craig?
Sure. I mean, so this is and somebody actually may explain them better than me. I mean, this is a sort of anti-Trump group coming from the right that is putting out, relatively slick videos that are, criticizing Trump and looking to obviously help him, prevent him from getting reelected. And so, so their videos are very much in, I guess I would say, sort of like a traditional kind of political style of attack ad type things, where they're trying to undermine Trump and point out, in a lot of these cases recently, where they say his leadership has failed around the response to the coronavirus. And then, of course, we have, our Plandemic video, which is elevating a known, anti-vax, disgraced scientist, as well as some other people sort of from that same community, sort of saying like this whole virus is just a planned thing to control you, and pushing that narrative. And so, David makes the accurate point that, what they're claiming and what they're implying are at very different scales. Like the Plandemic is like 100% a conspiracy-born video that is slickly produced, and that for a lot of people seems to them indistinguishable from a quality kind of news reporter documentary, which is, of course, by design. And then you have the sort of Project Lincoln things, which, as I say, are a little bit more like in this political attack ad style, but they are optimized for social media and for social sharing, and optimized to really go viral and portray Trump in really worst possible negative light. And so, both of them have an idea. Both of them are trying to think about how to get that idea to spread. But the scale of the kind of falsehoods and the scale of the claims that they're making are at really different levels, I would say. We've had misleading political ads like the Project Lincoln things, for almost going back, decades, right? I mean, since TV ads started. And so it sort of fits within that realm of sort of a known misleading piece of political communication meant to sway people's minds. And that's something that fact checking has, tried to deal with for a very long time, right? Plandemic is born of a networked environment by a coordinated campaign bringing together multiple communities of the alternative reality universe, whether it's anti-vaxxers, anti-government extremists, and others, to kind of create a unifying whole narrative like conspiracies do in order to sway people and to basically undermine their confidence in all of the democratic and medical and scientific institutions around them. So like the scale of one trying to prevent Trump from being elected to the other of basically trying to undermine the entire ecosystem and undermine our entire scientific basic knowledge, they're different. And so what's the response to them? A basic fact check on the Plandemic, frankly, I think is important and necessary, just like with a political ad, because like Donie, I was getting emails from people I'd never met and I'd never heard of, just asking me like, this pandemic thing looks really compelling. What am I supposed to think about it? Like people just emailing me out of the blue. And at that point I was like, oh shit, they really hit the number on this one now. And so I mean, I think we, again, you look at the tipping point thing, which we talked about, but the pandemic piece, we have to pull back the curtain on how this is a coordinated campaign that has been taking part for weeks, and is engineered to really sway people to, a view of reality that's divorced from it, rather than just sort of portraying Trump in the worst possible light. And so I think, you have to respond to both. But if we don't pull back the curtain for people and help them understand how the pandemic is like the culmination of something that has been going on for weeks, of this great convergence of alternative reality communities, then I think we've failed in that respect, as people have sort of said. So like, I think some of the approaches are the same, of like, where did this come from? Who's involved? What are the claims? Like all of that is the same, but the scale of them and understanding that one is positioned in traditional American political communication and one is from an entirely different alternative reality universe is, I think, really important to help people understand, why these things are different, even though they both might have misleading things going on.
And I just wanted to jump in and say, so we've been looking at pandemic as a keyword for a couple of months now, and it started really to take shape, like Craig was saying, creating this unified narrative around Fire Fauci. And Fire Fauci was obviously a kind of call to action, and we see it being chanted at many of these reopen protests. But the pandemic wasn't a documentary, right? It was a meme first. And it was something that this documentary has really used in a way, the conspiracist communities and have sort of marshaled them in this direction. And one of the things that we're going to be discussing on my webinar next week is the trouble with science, and this idea that science moves really slow. Science can be confusing. Science is uncertain. Today, we just got a bombshell peer-reviewed study saying that hydroxychloroquine doesn't do what Trump hoped it would do, which is really disappointing, because I would love for us to have a treatment at this stage that is promising. And it looks like remdesivir might be the one. But if you don't know how science works, you can become really susceptible to narratives like the portrayal of the one in the pandemic documentary. Production value's high. They drop that she's been published in Science. They don't tell you her story's been retracted, right? Which is a big deal. Like if you publish something and it gets all the way through peer review and it gets into the gold star journal of science, like this is the upper echelons of scientific prestige and journal, and they check everything. If your paper gets retracted, that's really concerning, right? On top of the fact that, of course, Brandy's reporting has really shown that this person in the video says, I'm not anti-vaccine, but in her actions leading up to this moment, obviously is, right? And it's all part of this broader schema that we've been looking at related to how are anti-vaccine narratives going to show up in the public, who is going to get tailored messaging specifically around vaccines, and then what is going to be the more populist narrative around the vaccine. So we're going to see many different confusing things about vaccines over the next few months, and part of it is going to be wedded to this this emerging conspiracist narrative around a pandemic, and that everybody's making money off of this vaccine. And we have to think about, as a country, what we want to push forward in terms of how, for me, the big political question is who gets the vaccine first, not, if we should, use it or not.
And I think that connection to Dr. Fauci, to me, is the most important element of all of this, which is he's somebody who right now on the left and the right is seen as somebody who can kind of bring the country together around the pandemic. He's the person that you want to bring down reputationally because he's the one that you have the whole country behind. And I think for me, the concern of this like constant drip, 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 drip of undermining the idea of a vaccine. I mean, surveys are saying, one that CUNY School of Public Health put out, that almost 30% of New Yorkers are already saying they won't take a vaccine. If we have 18 months of this shit, like that's the thing. And I suspect that the platforms are pretty concerned about this, because a lot of this, and we should have a conversation in a second about whether or not the platforms have done the right thing around the pandemic video, but a lot of this content doesn't hit their policy guidelines. And so each one of these atoms of content doesn't necessarily hit it, but we don't have any research about the cumulative effects of this stuff over time. And that's what I'm really worried about, which is if we see each of these things individually and we're playing whack-a-mole, I worry that historians will look back and be like, wow, they really didn't have a clue what this was going to do, you know, if we looked at it as a whole. So we're 10 minutes out. This is only 10 minutes to go after the platforms. But actually, Martin Schenk asked this question earlier in the chat, which is, you know, what is the best thing around a video like this? Is this should be an overlay from YouTube and maybe a gray box that takes you to Wikipedia, or should they be taking it down? And I know Brandy and Joan touched on this yesterday in the piece, but any thoughts about what the platforms should be doing around all this content?
I don't know what the platform should do. Like, I think that's a really hard job, and I don't envy them at all. My job is to sort of document what's happening. And I think, you know, what's really interesting about this is Joan, for my article, was talking about how, you know, it was really, it's almost like a badge of honor, right, to be moderated at this point. And for so long, people on the right have been trumpeting this claim of censorship, that Facebook and others are censoring conservative voices. And so what was really interesting about this piece, and I'll tell you all because we're friends and I'm not worried about spreading this message, but you know, on the website of the Plandemic movie, it was literally from the get-go, they said, download this, share it as many times as you can, because a lot of people don't know how to download, how to rip a video from YouTube, but this one took the guesswork all the way out of it. Said, download this, share it, spread it far and wide. Like, that was really brilliant to me. And the idea of like a misinformation life cycle and making this video go crazy, that was really smart on their behalf. So I thought that was super interesting. And, you know, yeah, YouTube took it down after a day. Facebook is like struggling to get all the videos down too, but like, it's been seen millions and millions and millions of times already. It's the cat's out of the bag at this point. And if anything, it feels like, yes, it should be down because this is dangerous. It's telling people not to wear masks. It's telling people to go to the beach and like cure yourself with sand. Like, that's something that like shouldn't be trumpeted as like actual fact. Actually, at the California protest yesterday in Sacramento, there was a woman with a sign that said, "Have you heard of Judy Mikovits?" And "Oh no, I will not wear a mask." Like, it's happening. You see it happening in the real world health effects in real life. So it should be down. But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, because that takedown, as Joan said, and she can talk more eloquently about it, but just reinforces their sort of status as a, you know, whistleblower who, you know, the man is out to silence you.
And I think this also gets down to the sort of reputational risk that places like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter take on. Like, especially YouTube, like people on YouTube who do create content for a living call themselves YouTubers, right? They associate themselves with the platform and the brand of the platform. And what that's come to look like in the past few years is actually different from what I think YouTube had planned. I think YouTube had really planned for YouTubers to be this vibrant community of creatives that were you know, showing people cool things. And instead we've seen that vibrant community of really creative and you know, interesting individuals move over to TikTok. And, you know, it's like TikTok is incredibly addictive. There's not a huge time investment in every video. But with YouTube right now, what you see is the people who are, you know, resorting to the platform and using it as a way to make money or as a way to create a media cycle. Like this video, we saw a few others like earlier this week that were like, this video will be taken down within 24 hours, watch it now, right? This limited edition content as some kind of mechanism for getting people to cover it. I think we have to be careful as journalists and researchers covering these takedowns, because when you break terms of service that it's going to take a while for the platform to catch you. And if part of your media strategy is knowing that you're getting a takedown, then who's chasing who, right? Like, who's getting what? And something like this, I just will say, because I'm in like a galaxy brain kind of mood today. I've been looking at the original versions of PPE and the plague doctors, those doctors with the big mask on that had this nose to it that looked like a beak, but it was filled with flowers and herbs and things. And they believed that it cleansed the air that came in. And they also wore these wax coats, and they were called the plague doctors. And I was just thinking about PPE and the status and everything around it. And now we're starting to see, at least in speculative reports, a fight emerge between people who will wear masks and those who see wearing masks as a way to, kind of show their resistance to government. And so I'm trying to think through, these moments in time where we've always known that for some reason masks work, right? Historically, whether it's, maybe it's not the flowers and the scent, but that the fact that there was so much between you and with the plague doctors, so much between you and the airborne illness. So that shouldn't be up for debate, right? Like the masks work argument. But now we're seeing violence around enforcement of mask laws. We're seeing governments, like my city government now, it's $300 if you're caught outside without a mask on. They're trying to hand out masks and like not enforce the rule, of course, but it's definitely posing some problems for people who like to, go to the park and have a smoke or a drink. And so, so I'm just trying to think through like all of the ways in which this moment tracks back to other political moments when we didn't have social media, but we did have, other like terrible health crises. But that's a long way around of saying that essentially that platform companies cannot rely on reactive content moderation anymore. They have to have a proactive curation strategy around strategic amplification, especially like when things start to go viral and, the person's account has, 27,000 followers or something, and they're getting, 500,000 views in a couple hours. Like, we have to think about where the platform company needs to intervene, not necessarily just the content itself.
And we're coming up to time, and I actually see my colleague Alistair Reid in the chat giving out links to other things. But Alistair does ask an interesting question about, he kind of compares what we're seeing with the symptoms of the pandemic, which is this question of like, how can we get society to reach immunity? Do you think with this that more people are having conversations about misinformation and are helping each other navigate this? Or have you seen, as people who've been doing this work for a while, that society is becoming more aware of the tactics, or do we feel like we're in the same place as we were back in 2016?
I don't know that people are spending as much time necessarily thinking about the tactics like we look at it in a kind of a strategic way. But what's happening with this, because it is such a global event, because it has affected everyone's lives, the amount of people who are now understanding the impact and what it feels like to be targeted with misinformation and disinformation, and understanding the impact that it can have in their life and the life and in society overall, that's an astronomical growth, I think. And it is maybe like we have to go through this really horrible peak moment for people to sort of feel it and understand it in a little more of a tangible way, rather than an abstract thing of like Trump talking about fake news and something that might seem a little more academic. And, like a concrete example of that is, I wrote a story about nurses and them being targeted with conspiracy theories and them having people yelling at them, telling that the virus is a lie while they're literally coming out of working in a COVID unit. And Brandy's colleague Ben wrote a story about doctors. And it's like, these are nurses for 18 years in the US have been the most trusted professionals. Gallup poll, 18 years in a row. Now they have people telling them they are liars and they're fakers and they are betraying, you know, the country and the world. And so, I mean, this is a really low moment, and it is making a lot of people, different people working in different aspects of society, realize the trust crisis that we've been going through probably for decades, and how that's being exploited for a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about so far. And so for me, I think that is one of the big things that's going on, is it's touching so many people and people are understanding it in the context of their daily life. But I don't know for sure what comes after that. Like, okay, so that happens, and then what? Like, does it continue to deteriorate because people get so, you know, this becomes the feeling of new life? Or do we stand up and do something about it? And that question of how we build the resilience, how we build that immunity, to go with the metaphor, I mean, it's a really tough and difficult question, and it's a whole of society response that's required. And when you have people as splintered, for example, as they are in the United States, and movements really trying to cleave, you know, create those divisions even more, the whole of society response becomes that much more difficult. So I think it's undetermined where we end up as a result of it.
Yep. Thanks, Craig. And there,
for everybody. Hey.
There are great questions coming in, which always happens just when you finish up. But I just wanted to stress that we will be sending out an email afterwards with lots of links that have either come up in the chat or answering some of your questions directly. So look out for that email. We will also turn this into a YouTube video so you can share with other people if this conversation has been useful. I have really enjoyed it. It's a reminder, as ever, that we often get to do like sneaky, if a reporter calls, you get to talk about it for 10 minutes, but it's actually really nice to have a longer time to chat. But Joan, do you want to talk about your great webinar that you're about to run in about an hour?
Yeah, we got one coming up at 1 o'clock. We've got Liz Dwoskin from the Washington Post, who's going to be talking about her work on content moderation. And then Sophia Noble and Sarah Roberts from the UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. And we're going to be talking about content moderation during a pandemic and all of the systems, the technical systems that are currently falling apart, and where AI is sort of being made to fit into this situation, and it's failing us remarkably. So yeah, so lots of nerdy talk coming up at 1. And if you don't sign up for the webinar, you can also watch it on the WGBH YouTube, because they're going to be co-live streaming it. And there's a tweet with all the sign up information in the chat. But I'm really excited about it, and I'm just gonna go spend the next hour with my spouse so that she doesn't feel lonely. Spend all day talking to screens. It's a weird job.
Yeah, but thank you very much. I know this is a crazy time for anybody doing disinformation. I woke up this morning, I was like, oh God, I feel bad that I'm taking 3 reporters away from their beat. But thank you very much. Yeah, we will send out the email, watch for that, and I'll see hopefully all of you in real life one day soon.
You got it.
Bye.
Bye.
Enjoy.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.